Welcome to today's sessions with a cup of Tableau. Just a short session in the afternoon. Take a little bit of a break from normal work and go into a few details on some Tableau terminology and how certain things work within Tableau. Today, I want to kick it off with a very common conversation that the fact that the color blue and green that are visual cues in Tableau for field does not mean the same as the difference between dimensions and measures. So I'm just going to show you Tableau really quick, just so we're all on the same page with regards to what I mean when I talk about blue and green and when I talk about dimensions and measures. So I'm just going to pull Tableau in real short. So this should be familiar. I am expecting you to be at least familiar with some of the terminology in Tableau and how Tableau looks like. So when we look on the left-hand side, where we have our data pane, you can see that I'm connected to the data source Superstore. So this everything that I'm showing you is used with Tableau's standard Superstore. You can have that with any installation. You can also find it online. That sample Superstore. Um, if you're working with a different version, your numbers might look slightly different when you're using the same type of steps, but the general idea is the same. When we're talking about dimensions, we're talking in the data pane where we see, in this case, I'm using one object, slightly above that gray line. This particular part that I'm highlighting at the moment, that's what we call our dimensions. That's the top part of our data pane. Then we have our bottom part of the data pane. That's when we're talking about our measures. So whenever I'm talking dimensions, that's when I'm talking about the top part. When we're talking about the bottom top part, that's when I'm talking about measures. So dimensions, measures. That's why I'm usually referring to them in that order as well, because they go from top to the bottom side. Now, when we're talking about green and blue, that's maybe slightly less obvious. Before, at the front of every one of the field names, there is an icon. That icon has a certain color. As you can see, all these locations, such as country and region, that icon in front has a slight blue color. And we go to our measures at the bottom at the moment. We can see that discount and profit, which are numbers, all have a green value. And when you select those values in the data pane, you can see them as green, such as profit. When I select it, there's a green value there, a green color. And when I go to my shipping date or my segment, you can see this currently has a blue color. So when we talk about blue and green, that's literally the colors blue and green. So hopefully that is all clear. Um, Before I forget, this particular session is being recorded so we can use this on YouTube just so that you're aware that any questions that you might have, then I might address them during this session and that will all be recorded. If you do have a question, there is a Q&A section. You should be able to find that in the Zoom tools that you have. Uh, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A. You can also use chat if Q&A, you cannot find it. That's absolutely perfect. I'll keep my eyes on the Q&A and the chat. It might be that I won't answer straight away because I'm in the middle of an explanation, but just so you're aware, sort of, that I'm keeping my eyes open for the Q&A and the chat. So very, very simply, it sounds simple when we're talking about dimensions and measures. The difference between dimensions and measures is that a dimension will split your view, whilst a measure will fill your view. I'll go into more detail when we're looking at those differences. A dimension will always determine the level of detail of your visualization, whilst a measure will be aggregated to that particular level of detail. Dimensions are not aggregated, whilst measures, standard in Tableau, are automatically aggregated. We can move away from that, but that's a separate discussion. But measures will aggregate and dimensions we will not aggregate. So that's the difference between dimensions and measures. It has nothing to do yet with discrete and continuous or blue versus green. That's the next part. We have blue versus green. What does that mean? Blue values are discrete, whilst green values are continuous. And blue values will create headers or Tableau headers, whilst green values will create an axis. Blue values are also finite values, so we know which values they will have, whilst green can have a range from minus infinity to infinity. Somewhere on that range, there's those values. Now, how does it look like in Tableau when we're talking about that difference between dimensions and measures? I'm just going to grab and pop up Tableau. Now, we normally, when we're building a scatter plot, I will just grab this particular sheet. With a scatter plot, we'll have measures and dimensions, and we use green and blue values. And in Tableau, you use sort of both of them, but now focus on the fact that we're using uh, measures mostly. So we have, for instance, this particular value, profit, which is a measure, and I know that it is a measure because it's at the bottom side of my data pane. I can see that sort of uh, gray divider, and I'll drag profit onto my row shelf, and I'll drag, in this case, quantity, for instance, onto my column shelf. I'll just do something quick. I've just matched, I need sales as well at a later stage, but as you can see, currently I am using those measures and they are being aggregated standard on Tableau setting. There's no level of detail, so it is on the what we call the table level that we're aggregating. Now, as soon as I pull in a dimension, such as segment, and I pull that into the visualization, for instance, on color, we can see three different colors. On the right-hand side, I can also see my legend being created, those three values, and I can see that the measures are aggregated at that particular level of detail, and segment is driving that level of detail. If that makes sense, we'll now create a similar scatter plot, but instead of a dimension to split, we'll actually try and add a measure as well. So I'm actually going to use the same values, quantity and profit, on my column and my row shelf. So we have quantity columns, and I'm just going to do a quick peek, and it was profit on our row shelf. Again, we have that same scatter plot. It's being aggregated because we're using our measures. Now, if I drag, for instance, sale, which is also a measure, I dragged it onto detail, we can see nothing is happening. So when we only use green values, or let's not say, sorry, when we only use measures, we're not splitting and not determining the level of detail. Now comes the next step, which is blue versus green. And I made a little bit of mistake. I said we only use green values, only using measures. As you may notice, I'm just going to pull back sales from now, from this particular visualization. On the value of sales, that particular field, I can right click any field in my data pane. And as you can see, I have two options. I can actually convert it to be discrete. Remember, that's blue. When I select that value, I'm actually setting that particular value sales to be discrete, but it's not a dimension. It's still a measure. So therefore, already you see a very big importance part that dimensions and measures are something very separate. Now, this discrete value, this blue field, which is a measure, I will now place this blue measure onto detail. As you can see, because it is a measure, it is being summed, and still there is no level of detail in our visualization because we only have measures. Aside from what color they have, we only have measures in our visualization. As soon as I use segment from my dimensions. I'll drag in segment on detail, and we have those three dots again. I'll actually put that on color, and we have the same visualization. Now, the difference between green and blue is the fact that it creates a header, or is it creating an axis? So as I just changed sales to be a discrete measure, if I drag this into rows, it is creating a header. It's still being summed, but it's creating one value, one header. I'll move this away. I'll make this a continuous dimension once again. It was sales. I'll put that onto rows. As you can see, it's being summed. It's a measure. We're summing our measure. And now it's creating an axis because it's being green. So once more, we can have our measure as discrete. It will create a discrete but summed header. If we change this, and we can always change this in our visualization as well by right-clicking the field, changing it to be continuous, and there we go. Once more, I'm creating my axes. It's still a measure. Now we'll go one step further. I'm just going to go and undo what I've just been doing. We see that sales field, and it's currently a measure. I can actually drag this to my dimension side. Now I have a discrete dimension. Dragging this into view, it asks me, do you want to add everything? I'll add all the members because this is all of the individual values for sale. As you can see, I'm not aggregating because it's not a measure and we only aggregate measures. It is also discrete because it is blue and therefore we're creating those headers, and because it's a dimension, we're not aggregating. Again, we can have a right click on that field. Instead of saying I want to convert it to a measure, I can also use to convert this to be continuous. Tableau will have a continuous dimension. Dimensions will not be summed, but because it's a green field, Tableau will create an axis. As you can see, I have an axis. I have all of these individual values. I do not have sum of sales. I just have the value, individual value for sales. And these are all of the individual marks. The bottom left, we can also see how many marks do we have. That's 6,144. Changing the value to discrete, I still have 6,000 at the 6,144 marks. If I move this, and I'll actually remove this particular value, I'll put sales back to being a measure. So Tableau will start to aggregate. I'll move that aggregated measure onto my rows. As you can see, I have only one mark, and that's a particular control value. If I right click, I'll change this to be discrete. I still have, as you can see, one mark. As I said, the blue versus green means I'm creating an axis, yes or no, whilst dimension versus measure is telling me, am I aggregating? Yes for a measure, no for a dimension. I will not be aggregating dimensions. That's what I wanted to talk about by explaining you the difference between dimensions and measures. What's the particular difference? And what's the particular difference between blue versus green, as they are not one and the same. Are there any questions so far? Perfect. If there are no further questions, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you learned something, particularly if someone's telling you, I'm just going to put in this discrete field and it's a green field. Well, that's not discrete. Discrete and dimensions are, they do usually go hand in hand, but it's not always the case. Not all dimensions are discrete, and as not all measures will be continuous, as you may have noted. Next week, we're going to talk about calculated fields. At what moment do calculations happen in my calculated field? What type of options do I have there? On the 23rd, we'll talk about table calculations, particularly about the difference between direction and scope. What does that actually entail? The last week of March, we'll talk about how do you create a partial drill down or use Tableau's innate ability to create a partial hierarchy almost. And we'll end these sessions with things I wish I knew when I started working with Tableau that I do know now, but I wish I had known when I just got started with Tableau because that would have saved me a lot of time. But that's it for today's session. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to follow us on LinkedIn, you can scan this code. I'll leave this up for now. Or you can get in touch with us at info@theinformationlab.nl.